Tonight on Primetime Politics, rallying the First Ministers.
You know, we can give ourselves, as Canadians, much more than anyone else can take away. And we can do that by working together, and that's what today's agenda is about.
Mark Carney holds a meeting with the country's premiers, his first since becoming Prime Minister, and just days ahead of an expected election call. Coming up, we will find out what Canada's First Ministers had to say about trade, tariffs, and Trump. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. Well, Canada's new Prime Minister had his first opportunity to meet his provincial and territorial counterparts today. Mark Carney gathering with the country's other First Ministers in Ottawa to talk about interprovincial trade and ensuring the lines of communications remain open as Canada faces the economic threat of Donald Trump.
Thank you very much, Doug. And we have to do things that we hadn't imagined possible before at a speed that we haven't moved before. And one aspect of that is we need builders, and it's part of the reason why earlier today we've brought back the level of the capital gains tax so that those who take those risks get the rewards.
Well, CPAC's Andrew Thompson is at the Canadian War Museum here in Ottawa. That was the venue for today's meeting where most of the First Ministers attended in person. So, Andrew, we just played there for people at home a bit of Mark Carney, the Prime Minister, as he opened up today's meeting. But talk to us about what else we heard from Mark Carney, because, of course, that meeting took place and then it ended, and we did hear from the Prime Minister address the media again. He talked about helping Canadian workers, Canadian businesses, for example, speeding up the timeline to qualify for EI payments for workers, temporarily suspending some business taxes to help them stay liquid. And then he talked about nation-building projects and made a big announcement. Talk to us about that.
Right, Michael. Of course, a big focus, as you say, internal trade, as well as building a more integrated Canadian economy. Mark Carney said that Canadians are capable of nation building, and that now is the time to act when faced with what he's calling a crisis. And he had this to announce. Take a look.
First Ministers agreed today, and again, I thank them for this. We agreed today to develop a national trade and energy corridor strategy. For transportation, for energy, for critical minerals, and digital connectivity. And so the agreement is to turn what has been a concept into a reality that will diversify and strengthen our economy. And to make that concrete, the federal government, my government, is acting now in several ways. Let me begin by saying that we are committing to remove all exemptions, all federal exemptions, under the Canada Free Trade Agreement. We're introducing a new First Mile Fund to provide capital to build transmission and transportation networks to link extraction sites to existing rail and road networks. In other words, if you think of a critical minerals project or something that's away from an existing network, linking them in can be decisive on the economics and whether they get built. We are creating a one-window approval process. We are committing to table legislation by the 1st of July for goods to travel across the country barrier-free or free of barriers, of federal barriers. So we're combing through all federal legislation for those barriers. We intend to, from a federal level, to have free trade by Canada Day.
All right, Michael, and we also did hear the Prime Minister talk about Donald Trump once again, the President again targeting Canada in his remarks earlier in the day. The Prime Minister asked about when he might talk to Donald Trump about some of these issues. He again returned to this issue of respect for Canada, saying that it's not a high bar to treat Canada as a sovereign nation.
Well, certainly some words added to a big announcement, Andrew, ahead of what's expected to be a Sunday election call. So more on that a little bit later. But right now, Andrew Thompson at the Canadian War Museum, thank you for covering the meeting of the First Ministers today. Well, as I said, the Prime Minister is expected to visit the Governor-General this weekend, asking her to dissolve Parliament and call for an election. And ahead of that, Alberta's Premier is putting the next federal government on notice. Danielle Smith saying the Trudeau government hurt the oil and gas industry in her province, and she wants a number of Trudeau-era policies repealed And if they are not by the next government in Ottawa, her government will strike what she calls a so-called fair deal panel to decide how Alberta will respond.
And if there is a true change of heart, then the Prime Minister and his cabinet will move in that direction. So that I want to be able to give whoever becomes a Prime Minister very clear identification of our pressure points and see within 6 months if they're able to address all of those. And if they don't, either one, then we're going to have to do what my predecessor did the last time around when similar frustrations were faced for similar reasons. And we'll do a broad fair deal panel review. We'll go and talk to Albertans and see what they would like us to do in response.
The Alberta Premier Danielle Smith. Now, Jonathan Wilkinson is the Minister for Energy and Natural Resources, and I spoke to him earlier a little bit about what we heard from Alberta, but other topics as well. Minister, good to see you again. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
Listen, I want to begin with the Prime Minister, a comment that Mark Carney made yesterday, because he was asked whether or not he was committed to building pipelines. In the past, he said he was open to it. He was asked how committed he was, and he said yes to building pipelines across the country, yes to building energy infrastructure like the carbon capture project associated with Pathways Alliance in Alberta. You know, it has me wondering, is your government actually flip-flopping on its policies related to oil and gas?
Oh no, I don't think so. I mean, we have seen a lot of work and a lot of progress in the oil and gas sector, but also, you know, concurrent work and progress with respect to clean energy technologies and a range of different energy generation technologies. In the case of oil and gas, you know, I've been a long-time supporter of the Pathways work in terms of carbon capture and reducing the production emissions associated with producing oil and gas in a world that continues to use oil and gas. And with respect to pipelines, I mean, it is important for us to diversify our trading relationships. That was essentially the argument for the Trans Mountain pipeline, which this government helped to facilitate building, and for some of the liquid natural gas facilities, and there are 3 presently being built. But I would also say that it's important this be done in a manner that is consistent with Canada's international commitments to fighting climate change, and that projects are actually assessed on the basis of project economics. And there are some projects, the LNG projects in particular, that clearly have an economic basis. And going forward in terms of other kinds of pipelines, those are things that we will have to see. I mean, at the present time, as you will be well aware, there is no proponent for another oil pipeline in this country.
Mm-hmm. Although, you know, we continue to hear from the Alberta Premier, Danielle Smith, putting out a statement yesterday where she still reiterates a lot of the things that she's been calling on Ottawa to do, the Liberal government to do, among them repealing Bill C-69, which goes to environmental assessment. Will your government repeal it if you're now, I guess, working more closely to develop pipelines across the country?
No, we're not going to repeal it. I mean, you know, Ms. Smith says a lot of things. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure that she's always actually read the information, including the Impact Assessment Act. The Impact Assessment Act was designed to ensure that we actually could get major projects built in this country, but that they were done in a manner that respected the constitutional rights of Indigenous peoples, and that we actually addressed concerns that were being raised about the environment. Under Stephen Harper, they did what that government did, what Premier Smith is essentially suggesting, which is they ripped the heart out of the environmental assessment process, and people lost faith that there was any integrity to it, and nothing could get built. I mean, look at the Harper record. Nothing got built in this country. Everything got litigated. So, you know, if Premier Smith actually wants to see things done, you know, and move forward in terms of major projects, she really should be actually applauding the Impact Assessment Act. It works better than the provincial systems in terms of assessment, and we have committed, including her minister, to doing a lot more to integrate the way in which we actually do permitting to try to ensure that good projects can move forward expeditiously.
Okay, what about other measures though, like the industrial carbon tax, the emissions caps? You know, the Trump administration says it would do away with similar measures to allow America to quote, and this, of course, you've heard this from Donald Trump, drill baby drill. Will Canada drop those measures to stay competitive with the United States?
Well, the industrial carbon price is a critically important element of having a climate plan that, yes, reduces emissions. And we saw today the announcement of Canada making significant progress, further progress on emissions reductions, which is all good news. but to do so in a manner that is incents innovation and that actually ensures the creation of lower carbon products that are going to have value in the world going forward. Countries like the European Union or organizations like the European Union, which are putting in place a border carbon adjustment mechanism, which essentially penalizes people who don't actually produce low carbon products. So not doing the work on the industrial price will actually penalize us from the perspective of trying to diversify our exports. So we will continue with an industrial carbon price. I think it's very disappointing that people like Premier Smith, who has said that she actually believes in climate change and believes that we need to actually get to a net zero future by 2050, and oil and gas executives who wrote a letter to a number of folks earlier this week calling for the elimination of the industrial price. A price that they all supported, including a number of very specific quotes that I actually included in my response to them. You know, it's very, very disappointing that that they are aping what Donald Trump is doing, which in the long run is going to be detrimental to our environment, but it's also going to be detrimental to our economy.
Okay, so you know there are people that have looked to the Liberal government on in terms of protect the environment. There are people now looking to the federal government, the Liberal government rather, to be working on things like pipelines to diversify. So how would you describe Liberal government pipeline policies under Prime Minister Carney? Will there be environmental guardrails? How would you describe those to Canadians?
Well, there absolutely are environmental guide rules, and there is a climate plan, and there are rules around species at risk and biodiversity. You know, what I would say is let's broaden this a little bit. Like, people get hung up on this issue of pipelines of oil and gas. It is important that we are diversifying our trade. We are diversifying the way in which we use and generate energy. That includes renewable energy technologies, that includes nuclear, that includes hydrogen, and it includes the use of oil and gas over the course of the coming decades in a manner that is consistent with achieving a net zero future by 2050, which is what we all agree from a scientific perspective we have to. You have to actually look at all those things in aggregate. And I think the track record of this government is we've actually been able to bend the curve on emissions in a significant way. I mean, emissions would be more than 40% higher now if we had been where, you know, we had continued on what Stephen Harper was doing. But we've done it in a way which is actually diversifying the economy, including very much in Alberta. So it's been very successful. We have plans in place. We are going to continue to implement those plans. Of course, we will be open to conversations and adjustments where those need to happen. But at the end of the day, this government remains committed to environmental protection and to the fight against climate change, just as it remains committed to building an economy that's going to have a strong future and create good jobs for folks everywhere in Canada.
Mm-hmm. Now, you know, Prime Minister Carney has also talked about new legislation to accelerate projects that involve energy and critical minerals. You know, what can we expect of that? How does that contrast to what we heard from Pierre Poilievre yesterday, promising these pre-approved industrial zones?
Well, I mean, Prime Minister Carney has talked about trade corridors and working with provinces and territories to try to look at trade corridors that actually can assist us with moving goods to market. And that certainly can, in some cases, include energy. For example, interprovincial transmission, which I think is something that most people think, at least on a regional basis, is a good idea. But again, we will need to ensure that we go through this in a thoughtful way that actually recognizes and looks at the economic imperatives and looks at how we actually do this in a manner that is consistent with environmental protection and with the respect for the rights of Indigenous peoples. Yes, we need to do it quickly. Yes, we need in this federation to be working more actively with provinces and territories, which is something that we are doing. But you cannot actually build this country nor get major projects done by simply ignoring the constitutionally protected rights of Indigenous peoples and simply running roughshod over the economy. And that's what Pierre Poilievre is suggesting we do. It is a fundamental misreading of Canada's constitutional architecture. And it is, I guess, perhaps not surprising for a fellow that actually has never worked a day on a major project or in the private sector since he graduated from undergraduate university and went into the House of Commons.
Mr. Jonathan Wilkinson, thank you for this. Thank you for answering our questions this evening.
All right, thank you very much.
Again, that was the Energy and Natural Resources Minister, Jonathan Wilkinson, who I spoke to earlier today. Now, meanwhile, in Washington, the U.S. president waded into Canadian politics for the second time this week, commenting on the upcoming election expected to be called on Sunday.
You know, a conservative until I got involved, because I don't care who wins up there. I frankly probably would do better with the Liberal than the Conservative, if you want to know the truth. But just a little while ago, before I got involved and totally changed the election, which I don't care about, probably it's to our advantage, actually. But the Conservative was leading against, I call him Governor Trudeau. The Conservative was leading by 35 points. So, you know, so I don't know about that. I think Canada is a place like a lot of other places. If you have a good candidate, the candidate's going to win.
The Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail, Tonda MacCharles, the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star, Joël-Denis Bellavance, the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the La Presse. Hello to the three of you.
Hi, Michael.
So, you know, here we are. We just heard Donald Trump. And again, he's commenting on the Canadian campaign election, second time this week. And he said, quote, "I don't care who wins up there. Frankly, would probably do better with a Liberal than the Conservative if you want to know the truth." You know, what type of impact does that have on Mark Carney and the Liberals, Bob? What does it have in terms of impact for the other parties involved?
Well, I'm not sure that it's going to have much of an impact. Anything that comes out of Donald Trump's mouth is usually not true. And I wouldn't be surprised if Conservatives here in Canada were begging the Republicans to please ask Trump to say something bad about Pierre Poilievre because he's in trouble, as we've seen in the polls. I don't think that it's going to have much of an impact, but it certainly helped Mr. Poilievre this week was able to come out and say, look, you see, he likes the Liberals because they're weak, they're pushovers, I'm Mr. Tough Guy, I'm a better candidate. But I don't think that it really is going to have much of an impact because I don't think Canadians believe anything that Donald Trump says.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a Trump discount. Anything he says, it's not inflated by a 25% tariff, but I think that Canadians are now getting their heads around taking everything he says a little bit more in stride than we have been because it's been a roller coaster for 2 months. And but I do agree with Bob that, you know, it does allow the Conservatives to have a bit of a pushback against the Liberal attack that they're, and they haven't used this in a while, but the MAGA light or the Maple MAGA stuff. So it's useful for the Conservatives in that way. But notwithstanding that, we're already seeing in the advertising that the Liberals are putting out that there's a repetition of language. There is a political rhetorical message that is being pitched by the Conservatives that the Liberals are saying echoes Trump. And that is a potential pitfall for him. Look, the polls are showing that there's been this surge in patriotism, surge for the Liberals, but that vote's soft. And so I think that potentially the Conservatives are going to look to exploit it further. And, you know, no one can argue that, you know, that was a gift to him to have Trump say, I'd rather a Liberal.
I see it in a bit of a different way. The comments by Mr. Trump to me is he's expressing some frustration because Mr. Carney has not bitten at anything that is thrown at him. And he said during the trip on which Tonda and I were, he said that he's not going to engage with Donald Trump until he shows respect towards Canada. He stopped talking about the 51st states. So Mr. Carney, even also by going to Europe before going to Washington, he's establishing his rapport de force with Mr. Trump in a very shrewd way, in my sense. And that, to me, is shows some frustration on the part of Mr. Trump that he cannot manipulate like a dog or a cat manipulates a mouse. You can't do that with Mr. Carney.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you know, you mentioned the polls, Tonda. You know, 338 today comes out with this analysis, and based on their numbers, they aggregate all the polling numbers, and 338 says that the Liberals right now are at 39, Conservatives at 37. There's a plus or minus 4% there. But when you translate that over to seat projections, again, 338 Canada saying that the Liberals would get, if an election were held today, 178 seats. Conservatives 129, the NDP all the way down to 9. You know, Bob, when you look at those types of numbers, how is that affecting campaign strategies right now, do you think?
Well, I don't buy those numbers. So those seat projections, I think a lot of the seat projections is voodoo stuff, but because all the polls also show, and this is unusual, first of all, Ontario decides the elections, Quebec decides which is going to be a majority or a minority. The Conservatives are still doing well in Ontario, largely amongst new immigrants. So this is unusual. Normally what happens is that the Liberals, when they get Ontario, but the Conservatives are still competitive there. So it's still a tight race, and it's still volatile. And I think the Conservatives are panicking a bit, for sure. They haven't got a message that's resonating with people, at least with Mr. Carney. I am going to deal strongly with President Trump, and I am going to build this economy. We've got all kinds of different messages from Mr. Poilievre, including this still acts the tax stuff, which is like that was last year's message.
And 2 years of Canada's broken messaging that was super successful for him, for Mr. Poilievre, is hard to turn around on a dime and say, oh, actually, I didn't mean Canada was broken. Actually, I meant it was like we're united and we're strong and Canada first. So I think that's a problematic switch from a political messaging point of view anyway. But I agree with Bob that, I think there's a certain amount of dread and apprehension in the Conservative ranks because they see the same polls we see and they're seeing their own internals. And as for Ontario, actually, it's a dead heat right now, which was unheard of 3 months ago. Yeah. It's a sudden and complete change. Atlantic Canada is swinging back into the Liberal camp. Quebec is being, right now, the vote in Quebec is a Liberal vote. The Liberals are leading. It's unbelievable. So.
And the Bloc Québécois is also scared because they're losing the support of the 55-plus crowd, which usually they vote traditionally a lot for the Bloc Québécois, but they're gone. They're moving away to the Liberal Party. As for the Liberal vote, one thing that is very interesting is that it's a very efficient vote. Whereas, so in national polls, if the Tories are not ahead by 2 points or more, they can't hope to win even a minority because the Liberal vote is so efficient in urban ridings and big cities. So that's, very scary numbers for the Conservative. If they are not ahead by at least 3 points, they can't have a hope of winning, forming the government.
Well, by evidence by the fact that they won the popular vote last time around and the Liberals were still in government.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I was just going to say, for the first time really in a number of elections, this campaign, everything will turn on this campaign. So much turns on this campaign. And yes, it's trite to say campaigns matter, but not just the issues and the Trump factor, but the leadership style of the leaders in the campaign and how they show Canadians they're prepared to confront a crisis and be transparent and accountable to Canadians and understand and be compassionate. That's all on the table. It's all an issue. Those are vote-driving things now.
Okay. And we have to be very, very careful about on April the 2nd when those global tariffs come in. That can change a lot of the election calculus from Trump to cost of living. And that is something that might help the Conservatives because Canadians may say, after 10 years of Liberal government, I think the Conservatives have a better message on cost of living. It may not because Mr. Carney is new and he's got good ideas as well. But I think we have to watch how the polls go after April 2nd and the first weeks after that.
Yeah, well, in the meantime, we've been watching Mark Carney, of course, now Prime Minister for the last couple of weeks or so, although officially just sworn in. Let's talk a bit about his performance because he's we know the fact that he had no political experience coming into this job. And yet here he is now answering tough questions, and he still seems to be tripping over the issue of assets. What do you make of what we've seen about Mark Carney so far and his ability to take on this job?
Well, look, he's very sensitive. He gets brittle when he gets tough questions from political reporters. We're a different breed than financial reporters who look up to the central banker. Tonda does not mince words when she goes after politicians.
And we love you, Tonda.
but I think he's made a mistake here. I think he should just he's now finally said he's going to set up a conflict of interest screen, and that would recuse himself from any dealings presumably with Brookfield Asset Management. But he still owns stock in the company and stock options, and I think it'd be cleaner for him, even though he's put everything in a blind trust. I think it's cleaner for him to be able to say, this stock is being sold. I don't have to recuse myself from anything anymore because I don't have any financial assets at all involved with Brookfield management assets.
I think what we saw is in his first couple of news conferences when he was sworn in, and then in the during the European trip we were on, you know, he was testy with tough questions, certain tough questions. But I also noticed over the course even of this week, because he's done a couple of other news conferences since then, he's adjusting, he's switching, he's dialing back the testiness, so he's learning. He acknowledged, you know, after the event in Iqaluit this week, you know, there was this sort of, the Rangers wanted to shake his hand. It was just a normal, natural moment, but he didn't know what to do with his mug. He's swinging his mug around, and he looks at me and goes, oh, I guess I haven't really mastered this retail stuff yet. I go, well, at least you know it.
Yeah.
I mean, he knows it. He's learning on the job. I think he's also, funnily enough, I think he's getting better at spinning a political message. Like, he does try to engage substantively on questions, but he's also getting better, I think, at some political spin, because he spun some of the stuff he did this week as a bit more action-oriented, when, in fact, the substantive outcomes are still to be seen. It was very much a positioning trip, let's say that.
Oh yeah, big time.
A lot of symbolism.
Yes, yes, and also very strategic. And now, in terms of the election and Mr. Carney's performance so far, I would say that, as Tonda mentioned, he's adjusting. But clearly in this election, I don't think Canadians are looking for the most charismatic figure or the most fluently bilingual person. They're looking for somebody who will reassure him and make sure that we go through this headwinds with the United States and come out alive out of it. And that's what I think they're looking for. That's why in Quebec, I'm hearing stuff like that. They pick on us, they attack us in the media when we mention that Mr. Carney's French is not up to the task to Mr. Trudeau, for example. And he said, no, give him a pass. We need somebody who can lead the country at a time when there's a lot of political
you know,
turmoil.
you can't take this away from Mr. Carney. He is enormously qualified.
Absolutely.
Two-time central bank governor. He's worked in major investment banks around the world. I mean, he can call up the hedge fund managers and big corporate guys. And he knows all these people, and he knows world leaders because he was involved in the G7, G20 and G7 as both Bank of Canada governor, but also the Bank of England governor. So he's managed real economic crisis.
And to Bob's point, he got sworn in as Prime Minister Friday. The next morning, he was meeting the President of France, he was meeting the King, and then afterwards of England, and then the Prime Minister of England the same day. Tell me a leader who could get those meetings aligned in one day, like that, 3 days after being sworn in.
It's also, to me, interesting that we're holding him to a standard to answer questions, be transparent about all of this, and to be responsive to media. There has been a different level of responsiveness from the Conservative Party for 2 years, really. And so some of that has to be seen in perspective, I think. But I, like Joël-Denis, am struck by the number of readers who are reaching out and telling us, stop trying to drive a good person out of politics. They're very sensitive to criticisms of Mark Carney.
That's very telling, Tonda.
Yes.
That is very telling from the readers.
They are not liking much of the critical writing around him right now.
And that's probably due to the political context that we're in.
Yeah, well, without a doubt, this is going to be a very interesting election to be covering. So glad you guys are here this evening. Bob, Tonda, Joël-Denis, thank you.
Thank you.
And that is Primetime Politics for this Friday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Now, as we've been noting, we are expecting an election call this weekend, possibly Sunday. We still have no official word, but if that does happen, we will be here on Sunday for you. Until then, have a great weekend. If not Sunday, we'll see you Monday.